Today I have my friend Matthias Roberts with me, and Matthias is a psychotherapist who specializes in religious and spiritual trauma. And you also recently released a great book. You released a book a couple years ago that we chatted about, but you also
Mm.
recently released a great book called Holy Runaways, Rediscovering Faith After Being Burned by Religion. And super stoked to chat about it. But more than anything, Matthias, this is just a great time for you and I to hang out as friends, right?
Yes, I'm so excited. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
It's
Well, with that said, I just did my little quick introduction of you, but there's so much more to who you are. So, who is Matthias Roberts to Matthias Roberts?
I I consider myself primarily to be a therapist. That's how I describe myself to folks. And um, but aside from all of that, like professional stuff, I l- love people. That sounds so
I would
cheesy.
hope so as a
Um,
therapist. That's a nice little attribute to have as a therapist.
uh-huh. Yeah, and yeah, these questions of like who am I to myself, they're so existential for me. Like I can get into a dark, deep hole really quickly. Um, mm, mm, yeah, I'm a writer. I'm a podcaster. I am really interested primarily in questions of how do people heal? And I feel like I explore that throughout my work, both as a therapist, but also my writing, my podcasting is these questions of what does healing actually take?
Mm,
And I feel like, I get into that in my personal life as well, but it is something that has fascinated me for years of what actually goes into the process of healing, and more emotional healing than anything else.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
mhm.
Well, one of those healing stories in your life is obviously your faith and how faith has changed in your life and everything. So let's talk a little bit about that. Uh, I would imagine, being a therapist, being a psychotherapist, and dealing with religious trauma and stuff. When you write a book around that, there's some level of research. Obviously, this book is very personal. There's lots of personal stories in it, but certainly, I would imagine there's some research that you've done going into this book. So, is there anything that came about in the research for this book that you're like, wow, I didn't know that before? Maybe there was some sort of, you know, therapy or psychology or neuroscience kind of fact where you're like, wow, that's really interesting. Or maybe there's something on like the theology side of things that you learned that was really interesting to you. But was there anything that came up in the research of the book where you're like, wow, did not know that before?
Yeah. Y y One of the primary metaphors that I use in the book is that of, like, concrete, and it's as a metaphor that kinda came to me as I was writing, as I was researching, of all things, concrete and how concrete is made, and something that there were a lot of things I didn't know about concrete, but, something that shocked me actually was that 2 things: concrete never stops hardening across its lifespan. So it
Really?
perpetually continues to harden. And if it depending on
So
how it's
even if after
mixed,
4 hours, it doesn't need to go talk to its doctor then, or
right? Yeah, it just uh, uh, maybe it needs to. It could be
like
important.
it's
And it's self healing if it's mixed correctly, and so those things tie into how I realized as I was kind of researching these things that I was taught to think about my faith in these terms, or I was taught to try to have a faith that would continue to harden over time, that would get stronger over time, a faith that would be self healing if anything ever came in as an attack, like this really tight system that could withstand anything that came against it. And I think those facts about concrete, I realize that's not theology, that's not psychology, but those things like kind of blew my mind a little bit,
Hmm.
and had a lot of fun with that metaphor. Mm.
Was there anything that came up kind of like as a self-discovery while writing this book that you didn't know about yourself before? Obviously, you're probably the kind of person that is always really reflecting deeply on yourself and your life. So, was there anything that this book writing process in particular brought out in that self-discovery for yourself?
Mhm. You know, I thought going into this book that the theology part of the book would basically be the easiest to write. I kind of
Mhm.
had I knew I wanted to like work with Renee Girard and James Allison, and kind of had a sense of like, here's how I'm going to write about God. Here's my argument. And about 6 months into the writing process, right as my first deadline was kind of flying by, I was only halfway done. I realized like I was right at that point where I was supposed to be writing the theology, and it was so much harder than I expected. And I kind of the realization was I thought I knew what I believed. And as I started to write that down, I kind of realized like I don't think I actually believe what I'm saying. And so I kind of faced this choice of I can either sit here and write what I used to believe, which would be pretty easy because it was pretty well packaged, or I could try to really be honest about where I'm at in both my
Mm.
belief, but also my lack of belief. That's really what was showing up for me was, do I actually believe any of this? And I chose to do the latter, because I felt like it was really important, especially when talking about rediscovering faith, to be honest about my lack of faith, and the way that that can interplay. And so that surprised me. I didn't expect that. Mm.
Was there anything in that theological kind of question you mentioned just now that there's a lot of like doubt, or there's still like a lot of like I don't know exactly what I believe about this. But is there anything theologically that maybe it came up in this book writing process where you're like, I actually feel very convicted about this. Like
Mhm,
I at this point in my life, no, I believe this. Every now and then that comes up for me where I
mhm,
just feel so convicted by like a theological belief. And I think in the sort of deconstructionist circles that I run in, there is this superiority of doubt and having kind of this like lack of faith and everything. And every now and then I run into these moments where I'm like, I actually feel super convicted by this.
mhm,
And even
mhm,
though I'm supposed to be, or like I run in circles where doubt and lack of faith are supposed to be kind of held held primarily. There's times where I'm like, actually, I don't really have any doubt or lack of faith about this. Like, I feel very convicted. Was there
yeah.
anything that like that came up, maybe theologically or politically or something along those lines, that came up in this book writing process?
Yeah. It's interesting because there was, and I feel almost apologetic talking about it because it feels in some ways I feel ridiculous in that this is something that feels so core to me. Because I know there's so much debate around it. But for me, and I don't believe that everyone needs to believe this, but for me, like a literal resurrection of Jesus, um, something hinges on that for me.
Mm,
And especially in some of the what I'm trying to argue in this book is that the subversion of violence, the subversion of violent systems in the world was made possible through the subversion of death.
mm,
And again, I understand and believe like it can be metaphorical for sure, and I understand those arguments, and I'm not close. I don't feel like I said, I don't feel like everyone needs to believe this. I don't care if you don't believe this. But for me, like it did shock me in a lot of ways that like, oh, like this literal resurrection, this literal death and resurrection actually feels really important to me in the way that I kind of think about how it plays out in the world.
mhm.
And yeah, again, I am almost embarrassed by that. Mm.
No, I mean, I
Mhm.
think there are probably a lot of people in the circles that we run in that are like, "Wait, what did you just say,
Uh-huh.
Matthias?" But, like,
Right,
I
right.
also I think there's something very curious there, for me, even though I feel kind of, like, agnostic about, like, the resurrection and its
Sure.
historicity,
Yeah.
but, yeah, like, for some people, I understand why it's like so important. I will say this for like my perspective on the resurrection. I do think that if Jesus did literally resurrect from the dead, it means nothing if it means that he is the only one.
Mm,
If he's the only person to ever resurrect from the dead and will ever resurrect from the dead, then that to me means nothing. But
yeah.
if he did
Mhm.
literally resurrect, then I think it could change everything if it also means that everyone also resurrects and has that resurrected life.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say I agree with that for sure. Yeah.
So again, like I mentioned before, this book is obviously filled with lots of memoir, lots of personal stories, and you share a lot about your own story. Can you share a little bit about kind of the faith that you grew up in and
Mhm.
where you're at now in your faith? So let's hear that whole faith journey.
Yeah. Yeah, so I grew up in a deeply religious family, very conservative, almost fundamentalist, and in some ways fundamentalist. But I think my parents had a very heavy emphasis on grace, which kept us from some of that fundamentalism territory in some ways. Uh, homeschooled, grew up literally at a Christian Bible camp, like a year-round Christian Bible camp. Like my parents were on staff, and so that's basically where I lived. And
Man, every Friday night for you was a trip.
it was.
Just
Yeah, and
sleep deprivation for Monday through Thursday, and then Fridays were just
and
nuts.
just going for it. Yeah, yeah. Y- and I kind of I loved that world. Like it was in some ways a really fun place to grow up as a kid because I didn't know any different until I started realizing that I was gay, and that kind of started putting a wrench in things very quickly. And had to really start to reckon with when I was in college. What do I actually believe about this? Like, because I was taught I had to change, and that God could help me change my sexuality, so that then I could be, a good Christian. And I had heard these rumors that there were people out there who believed that you could be, gay and Christian, queer and Christian, and be in relationships. And I I remember thinking like, okay, I'm like 18, 19 years old. They're asking me to make a choice to be like celibate for the rest of my life. And I was so sincere. I was like, if I make that choice, that means I'm going to like follow it for the rest of my life. So I better figure out what all these other people are saying before I make a decision like that. And that's really what started a lot of the questioning of theology, the systems that I grew up in, realizing like there are so many other systems out there. Discovered the Episcopalian Church and was amazed by it. And so
That's
like
why
I
you
mean,
believe in the literal resurrection. You those
probably, yeah.
Episcopalians got you, didn't they?
They did. So is this I mean, this in some ways a slow unraveling, but also like I mean, running away from the faith that I grew up with and trying to find a faith that felt like I could actually get on board with it. Where I felt like I belonged, but not just me, but all these other people I saw in the world who also didn't belong in the faith that I grew up in. And I deeply believed like if this faith thing is real, if God is real, then everyone belongs. Like otherwise it can't be real. Like I mean I realize this the logic behind that is probably not sound, but that's what I felt. Like if it's real, everyone has to be able to belong. Otherwise it's not real. And so this book really kind of chronicles my journey into trying to find that faith in the midst of being hurt, I think over and over and over again by churches and folks um, within the faith. Mm,
It sounds like you went kind of straight from like that almost fundamentalist evangelical world to, the more progressive side of things, the more kind of progressive world of Christianity. And there wasn't like a sort of halfway in between, or this kind of moment where you left religion altogether. Am I correct in making that assumption? At least the way you're describing it, it doesn't sound like there was this kind of period of time where you were non-religious and committed to being non-religious.
Yeah,
Or maybe I'm wrong.
there was never a time where I think I would have self-identified as non-religious.
Okay.
It wasn't until so I found the Episcopalian church, then I moved to Seattle, and then I tried to find a church in Seattle, and it was at that point that I started realizing that I had religious trauma.
Mhm.
And that was when I, like, did set everything down, but I was in seminary at the time. Like, I was still in these deep theological conversations, even though I had set my own faith down, but I still would have identified as a Christian. Like, it feels convoluted to me in some ways because I look back and even where I'm at right now, and I'm like, "Oh, am I religious? I don't really think I am. I don't think I was." And yet there's something sanity and the faith that is intriguing enough to me that I'm still in those systems that
Mhm.
it feels really hard to say, like, I am this or I am this. Yeah.
Mhm. The reason why I ask is I do think that it does seem as if people who went straight from like conservative evangelicalism right into some more progressive version of Christianity versus and there's lots of other people, where they leave conservative evangelicalism, and there's a period of time that they are not religious. They just sort of leave religion altogether, and maybe they stay in that world, or maybe they eventually go back into Christianity. But there is something distinct. There does seem to be a distinct difference in the way that people relate to Christian identity and Christian faith when it's those two different kind of journeys. People who never
Mhm.
really ever left Christianity, they just went from one kind of Christianity to another, and then those who did leave Christianity at some period of time or have continued to like are still not a part of it. And there's
Yeah.
some difference in that relationship with Christian faith and what they think about Christianity and all of that. I find it very interesting that those journeys have different perspectives then on Christianity, and I was just curious kind of what maybe you had thoughts around that or not, but anyway, that I'm just kinda rambling at this point, but I'm curious around that if you've noticed anything about that when it comes to people's experiences of either going from one kind of Christianity to another, or people who actually leave Christianity altogether at some point.
Yeah. I think about it through the psychology lens. Yes, I think like those are. I mean, there are many options, but those seem to be kind of like the two primary options that people choose. And I think folks who leave, there's something about, like, I in some ways, a lot of ways, I actually do wish I had left. Like,
Mm,
wish that I had been able to kind of get out of that whole world and start to find healing. Because I think often to really start to heal, we have to be able to split good and bad, right? So, like, splitting as a psychological concept is a developmental achievement, where we're able to categorize this is good, this is bad. And if we never learned how to do that, then we won't get to a point of integration. And so integration comes later, but splitting comes first. And I think it's a far more convoluted path to not split these things apart, and to not find an identity outside of the church, Christianity, faith, whatever you want to call it, um, because there aren't those kind of clear lines. And so I don't think one path is better than the other. I hope I'm not sounding like that. But I do think, like, in the psychology of it, there's something to be said for just being able to say, I am not involved with this system anymore. I'm getting out. I'm going to go figure this out for myself. And then that starts to lay, I think, more fertile ground for reintegration, if that's something people want, or reintegration in other ways that faith may not be part of it. Um,
mhm.
yeah, I think it's an important step. Um,
That's interesting you bring that up because one of the thoughts that I think that I have quite often is I fundamentally believe that something like conservative evangelicalism is inherently toxic.
yeah.
I'd rather it not exist in the world. At the
Mhm.
same time, there's a lot of things that came out of that world that have formed me and continue to form me. And for for example, and people who follow me on Twitter know this as I love making jokes about VeggieTales, and I loved VeggieTales, and I made a
Yeah.
joke a few weeks ago about something about VeggieTales, and I don't even remember what the joke was. I just remember it was a joke about VeggieTales, and this ex-evangelical person who I've never seen before. Got like really upset with me that I was like promoting this like very evangelical media and
Mhm.
and thinking that me even making a joke about it was me promoting it and therefore promoting all of evangelicalism or something.
Right.
And I was
Mhm.
thinking to myself, is it possible for me to have the conviction that I think evangelicalism is inherently a toxic thing and also think that there are some of these aspects to it that I think are fun and silly and goofy and also have been really formative in my life. And I think that kind of complexity in I think is possible, but I'm curious, like from your kind of therapist lens, is that something that is possible to have that conviction about a certain system and also knowing that you were formed and had good experiences in some ways, shape, or form by some of the things that came out of something that you think a system that you think might be inherently toxic? What are your thoughts on that from like a kind of therapist lens?
Of course. I mean, I think the reality of the world is that there is this is gonna sound like an absolute statement. Of course, there's nuance here because there's always nuance. Um, but there's good and bad in most things. Um, and holding those 2 things together doesn't make them less good or less bad, right? Like, but I think in order to be able to get to that point, we have to be able to have, again, developmentally very rigid boundaries. And so I think a lot of what we see in this kind of progressive movement is I think we have people who have maybe integrated their experiences, and we have people who don't want to and don't need to integrate their experiences right now, but are actually in that place of, here's my rigid sense of what is good, here's my rigid sense of what is bad, and anything that threatens my categories of good and bad, I can't actually handle. Um, w- w- we need, and again, I think this is developmental. I think we need it. So I hope people, again, this is my therapist trying to make sure everyone feels good and comfortable. Is I'm not saying one is better than the other or one is even more evolved than the other. But I am saying like some people need those rigid boundaries in order to then be able to find some more integration, find a sense of self. Um, some people may always think VeggieTales are very bad, and I think that's okay. Uh, other people may get to a point where they can say, "Yeah, I can hold all this complexity and this nuance together, and that's okay." Um, so I don't know if that actually really explained the psychology behind it, but um, that rigidity versus fluidity, I would say, is makes a lot of sense, especially if we have been profoundly hurt.
Mm,
Um, we tend to get more rigid in the service of healing.
mhm.
Um, mhm,
It does remind me of, and I think this is Richard Rohr that has said something along these lines of like transcend and include kind of thing. Like
mhm,
it's very important for us to obviously transcend from some of these systems that we may have grown up in that have hurt us and harmed us, but also there are parts as we go through healing that we're going to be like, oh wait, that was actually really good, informative, and it's actually important to include that as you go on in life.
mhm, mhm. Yep, yep.
You've already mentioned this word a few times in this conversation, but you've mentioned religious trauma.
Mhm.
And I hear a lot of talk about religious trauma these days, especially in the circles that we run in. What do you mean by religious trauma in this book? Is there some sort of like kind of technical definition that exists out there that you're using, or is there kind of a definition that you're just kind of working with when you're talking about it in this book? But I'm really curious what you mean by religious trauma.
Yeah. There is a technical definition of religious trauma. I tend to use the one that the folks over at the Religious Trauma Institute have kind of used as a definition, which I can never remember it right offhand, but it essentially is an experience within religion that has been too much for our systems to be able to handle. So ideas of like God hates you, you're going to go to hell, that then overwhelms our system and creates like debilitating physical effects.
Mm,
Um, that is not the definition, but that's some of the essence of the definition. I don't actually use the definition of religious trauma in this book uh, because I think for all the talk out there that I think is legitimate talk about like how are we defining trauma and like trauma has become too broad and everyone thinks they have trauma. um I do believe everyone has experienced trauma in their lives. I deeply believe that it's part of being human. Trauma is as ubiquitous as breathing. Of course, there is a scale to trauma. Some people have experienced far more severe trauma than others. Absolutely. But I am not, I don't really believe in this idea of gatekeeping who gets to call what trauma,
mm,
because trauma is a very particular experience to every person. What traumatizes the person sitting next to me in church may not traumatize me, and vice versa. So, yes, there are actual definitions out there. And I am far more interested in someone's experience of their own experience. Because if
mm,
someone's saying, I need healing, I don't want to say, well, but it doesn't fit the definition of trauma. So you don't really need to be healed. Like, no, like we are looking, people who use that word are trying on language that describes something about their experience, and that feels really
mhm.
important to me. Mm.
What are some, like, signs, of someone that might have religious trauma? Like, I would imagine a lot of the people listening to this podcast may have experienced some type of religious trauma, but maybe some folks are like, "Maybe I've experienced religious trauma, I don't really know exactly." What are some of those
Mhm.
signs for somebody to, like, kinda get a sense of whether or not they may have experienced religious trauma or not?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story of what happened to me when I was looking for churches in Seattle, and so I just moved out
Oh, I can
here.
think
I
of one church
had
in Seattle that, if we're talking about religious trauma, there's one I can really think of,
I did go to that church 2 Sundays.
oh
That's not
boy.
the church though that traumatized me because I knew I went more as an experiment because I was like, I want to see what this Mark Driscoll guy is actually like, and it was terrible. Um, but I had heard about, so I had kind of come to terms. I'd come to terms with my sexuality, and there was a church here in Seattle that had it was an evangelical kind of mega church that had just changed their policy on LGBT inclusion, and they were allowing queer folks at all levels of leadership. And I was like, this is perfect. Like this is the church for me. I think like it takes the kind of evangelical roots that I grew up with and integrates everything that I now believe around LGBTQ folks. I think this is it. So I find out the closest campus, go on a Sunday morning with a few friends, get into the church, and worship starts. And I find, like, my heart rate is just rising. Like, my heart is beating faster and faster, and I'm kinda looking around, trying to find the exits, looking around at everyone around me with a level of suspicion where, like, my cognitive brain could say, if these people are here, they likely accept me. We can't know that for sure, but this is probably a pretty safe space for me. My body was saying, this is not safe. Like, you need to get out of here now. I didn't pay attention to it. Like, I sat through the service, sat on my hands, like, tried to regulate myself, even though everything in me was wanting to get out. But that was one of the first indications for me that there was trauma. I was having a physiological response in an environment that my brain could say, I think this is safe, but my body was telling me something otherwise. And that disconnect, often, not always, but often can be a sign that there may be trauma involved.
Mm.
Trauma fragmentation is a huge one, being fragmented from our bodies, fragmented memory, not being able to put together a coherent story about what happened to us. That is often an indicator of trauma. That shows up most often, I think, in more physical forms of trauma, but can also show up within religious spaces for sure. There are other indications, but that sense of disconnect, a sense of I have to hold my body or keep my body in check. Um, Otherwise, I will be so profoundly uncomfortable.
Mhm.
It can be a sign. Mm.
That actually makes sense then why so many people who grew up in conservative evangelicalism but still want to remain in the Christian tradition, a lot of those folks end up in more like liturgical type of traditions like the Episcopal Church, like yourself. And it makes sense because the worship of from conservative evangelicalism to something like the Episcopal Church is so foreign to folks who grew
Mhm.
up in conservative evangelicalism. You know, all the smells and bells that are going on in the Episcopal Church or other kind of liturgical traditions, it just feels like like an entirely different religion when you
Yes.
go from one to the other, which is why, like, if you go into a more progressive evangelical space, that almost can be almost just as triggering because
Mhm.
the worship of that space would be very similar to like a conservative evangelical space. So that is interesting. That w- w- the trauma piece to that is probably why a lot of those folks who want to remain Christian end up going in a lot of those more liturgical spaces, is because it feels foreign enough where that trauma is not probably going to be as activated.
Yep. I think you're spot on there. Yep. Mhm. It is
Uh,
unfamiliar enough that it doesn't start to hijack the same systems. Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
One of the things I'm really interested in is how Christian theological beliefs shape our experiences. In fact, a lot of my thesis was about this, especially how it shapes our physiological experiences. What are some of the most common theological beliefs that negatively shape people's experiences? I can think of a million different ones that a lot of us who grew up in conservative evangelicalism believed, and then certainly have profound trauma in people's lives because of the things that they believed in that world. What are some of the kind of as you've worked with people who have religious trauma? What are some of those theological beliefs that they really held dearly at one point, that just keep coming up over and over again? Where it's like, well, that just probably is a really bad belief.
Mhm. I think it so much of it centers around the split of enlightenment between our brains and our bodies, like that sense of we cannot trust anything that happens in our bodies, and the only way to arrive at a right belief is through logic, is
Mm,
through correct thinking. I mean, I don't think it's the only root, but I think it's one of the major roots of so much of the harm that has been done, where we are taught that our bodies have nothing good in them and any signal that it's giving us is sinful and bad. Which, our bodies respond when we are in environments. Every environment we're in, our body is doing something. And Often when we are in environments where we are maybe close to trauma or being traumatized, if we have been taught we can't pay attention to our bodies, then it's just gonna fuck everything up even more. We're not gonna actually pay attention to the signs, the warnings, and stay within environments that do cause actual harm.
mm,
Um, so I think, on a broad level, like, that is one of the most, I think, insidious, belief systems that has integrated itself into evangelical theology of, like, your heart is deceitful and wicked above all things.
mhm. Yeah,
Being
denying the
translated
flesh.
into right. Yeah, being translated into any feeling you ever have is deceitful. Don't pay attention to it. Stay here because we know what's good for you. You
Mhm.
can't trust anything that you're feeling or sensing. Yeah.
Mhm. And that's similar to also the belief of total depravity, which I know has also really harmed and hurt a lot of people. And that's
Mhm.
one theological belief that I think, like, understood in a certain way, it kind of makes sense that, like, that or like maybe it's more closer to like original sin or something along these lines of like everything that we do is never going to be like perfect. Like there's always going to be some level of um not necessarily evil, but that like there's not perfection that's going to happen in everything that we ever do, and therefore that really affects everything. Like that makes sense to me. But the sense that everything that we do is just utterly and totally depraved. Even when you help the old grandma across the street, that is just an act of evil and sinfulness. Like those sort of beliefs really, I have found really harm and hurt a lot of people as well.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Mhm.
So, one of the things that I often hear from people who experience religious trauma is that that they long for the community that they maybe have left. They long for the kind of community that they've left.
Mhm.
When you grow up in an environment like evangelicalism, you really find a lot of deep community to the point where, in a lot of cases, almost all of your community is only from evangelicalism. And so when you leave that, you almost feel like you leave an entire community. You have nobody left. You don't have family or friends left,
Mhm.
and that really is like hard part of leaving a kind of faith. At the same time, I think it's really, really important for people to find community again. And for a lot of people, they want to find that religious kind of community again. And that's just a really difficult process to find an entirely new community. What are some of those like kind of tips or advice, or as you work with people who are like, I really long for that community again. How can I find that again? What are some of those things that you help them through, or what are some of the little bits and pieces that you're like, hey, this might help you as you find new religious community or community in general? What are some of those things that you let folks that you work with know?
Mhm. I don't actually have a lot of tips here, but more a sense of this is so difficult.
Mm,
And I think starting at that point of how difficult this is, one, it can feel like, well, what's even the point? But I hope people hear in that sense of just because you haven't found it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. Um, like church community is such a particular kind of community that doesn't exist in that same way. It's really hard to find any other communities that function that same way because churches are set up specific certain ways. Um, I think when I hear people talk about the wanting that kind of community, one way that I hear it is people who are wanting community where they get to be vulnerable and be met in that vulnerability by folks who also are kind of being vulnerable.
mm,
That there is this sense of connection that goes far deeper than just hanging out together, right? And I think
mhm,
that the church does fosters that through practices of confession, through practices of like, what's your sin? Like, sure, there's a lot of things that we can critique about that, but there's an inherent level of vulnerability that comes when we start to talk about these deeper things, when we start to share with people the things that we don't necessarily want to share, that it might feel dangerous to share. And so I think when people are thinking about how do I start to find that form of community again, my question is how can you start to foster that vulnerability in the connections that you do have? Um, How do you even know that it's safe to do that? These are in some ways open-ended questions. Like I think we have
mhm,
to define these things for ourselves because religious trauma often is communal trauma, which means that we're suspicious of any and all communities.
mhm,
And so it's working against us in a lot of ways because we find community, we get really scared. What if everything blows up? no community is perfect. That then presses on our trauma. Like slow processes of healing here. Um, but I think fostering that vulnerability is important. Uh, One way I like to think about it is, who are the people that you can open a bottle of wine with and chat all night, right? Like, fostering that, bringing those people together, it's going to feel awkward if no one knows each other, but paying attention to those things. How do I actually feel in the presence of this one person? And
Mhm.
then can I start to bring a group together, or find groups that feel that same way? Um, there's no recipe for it, and it probably will never feel like what church felt like. Um, can we hold compassion and grief around that, and still foster some of these other things that might start to fill a similar place?
Mhm.
Um,
I love that vulnerability piece, and you connected that obviously with like confession that you see in churches, and it reminds me a lot of like AA. You know, a lot of
mm,
folks that
mm,
realize like, hey, I've got a problem, and they come into community, and the first thing that they hear from everybody else in the community is, "Hey, I'm Mason. I'm an alcoholic," or "Hey, I'm whoever. I'm a heroin addict," or whatever. But there's that confession there right away. There's that
mhm.
vulnerability right away, and it breaks down for a new person, it breaks down that like hesitancy of, am I the only one here who's maybe a little fucked up?
Yeah.
And then you realize, wait, a lot of us are like have a lot of things going on in our lives, and our lives aren't exactly the way we want them, and you immediately are disarmed in that way. And so I
Mhm.
think like AA and sometimes even churches really model that really well. At the same time, like you mentioned before, that vulnerability actually does really open up people to the possibility of being really hurt really deeply
Mhm.
if things really get messed up. Um, but
Yes.
at the same time, it's what leads to transformation in people's lives. It is to be
Mhm.
part of that community and being vulnerable in community.
Yeah, absolutely. Mhm. Mm.
And the other kind of like thought I have around that is, again, like the thing that I hear from people all the time is that leave something like conservative evangelicalism and losing almost all other community is them thinking that new community isn't possible. And I think
Mm.
like one of the first things I always tell people, beyond like, hey, maybe there's like this church community or whatever, it's new community is possible. Like, you losing your community does not have the final say on this.
Mhm.
And new community could be in the next chapter of your life. And so I think just not like people not like settling into the hopelessness that they'll never experience community again. I think is really important for them to know that new community is possible is so important, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I very much, yeah, believe that it's possible, and I think it's so important to highlight, like, it takes time, and
Hmm.
I think a lot of churches have figured out a way to, in some ways, artificially create community that then turns into real community. But, like, you can go to a church, many churches at least, and feel like you belong from the first day. Like, that is so intentional, right? I think many of us have experience in churches and know the behind the scenes of how they even make that happen, right? Uh, Very few other communities work that way. Um,
Hmm.
Very few other communities are trying to be like, how do we make everyone feel like they belong and are included right off the bat? That's not how a lot of communities work. Um, and or can we start to be patient enough with ourselves and with other people to trust that that can still be formed, right?
Hmm.
That maybe the artificiality of the first Sunday, like, oh my gosh, all these people are so nice, isn't going to be there, but doesn't mean that community can't happen. Um, I think about like, like, can you go join like a pickleball league? Show up every week or whenever that people are, and just see what happens as you continue to show up. You might feel like an outsider at first. It might take a long time to start to feel like you're being integrated, and it likely will happen. Um, and can you also pay attention to yourself? Go ahead.
Nothing will, get you a part of a community more than getting your ass kicked by a 70-year-old pickleball player.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
What do you think about online community? Obviously, it seems like a lot of the people who leave evangelicalism find initially community on the online spaces, whether it's Twitter or TikTok or Facebook or Instagram, whatever it might be. It seems like that's sort of the initial community a lot of people find, and I think in some ways that's really, really great and wonderful that they're finding initial community through that. And at other times, it seems like if you just reside in that space and only find community there, you're really missing out on communities in person. I'm
Mhm,
curious, like, what you think about all of that.
mhm. I think online community can be as impactful as in-person community. G And I think there is something particular about in-person community, otherwise known as, like, bodies in the same room as other bodies, uh, that regulates our nervous system in ways that cannot be regulated through a screen. Uh, but I think often for many of us who have been harmed by community, online community actually allows us to practice being in community again without as much risk, right? It allows us to try on new ways of being in the world, try on new ideas, find deep friendships. Like, truly, most of my best friends in my life right now came from online community, right? That
Mhm,
then shifted into in person. But we can find, in some ways, our people online. Uh, Try these new things on, which then make it feel safer to move to the in person because relationships have already kind of been established. So
mhm,
I think there's a both and there. Yeah, there's a lot of practice that then I think that can allow for stronger creation of friendships and yeah, and community. Um,
mhm. So a bit ago, I asked you a little bit about some of the theological beliefs that have come up when you work with people that have really negatively shaped their experiences in the world and have created religious trauma. On the inverse of that, then, have there been any like Christian theological beliefs that you've encountered as you work with people that have actually really positively impact as as they heal and have been a part of the healing process? Has there been any theology in that healing process for people that have really positively impact their lives? I think about from my own experience as I came out of evangelicalism and eventually discovered like liberation theology and process theology and thinking about God in these very different ways and thinking about the resurrection or thinking about Jesus's death in these very different ways. I was like, whoa, this is definitely going to be a part of my healing process. Have there been any theologies or theological beliefs like that that you have found have been really have positively impacted and healed people from religious trauma?
mhm. That's really interesting because I think when especially when I'm working with like clients who are working with religious trauma, we rarely get into like what is a new theology, what is a new theological system.
Mhm,
But I'll tell you what for me feels really important is this idea that healing is even possible. That something good can be created out of chaos, or that order can be created out of chaos. Like that, I think is a Christian belief. I don't think Christianity has is exclusive to that belief, but I
right.
do believe in this sense of like goodness being created out of harm. Um, that feels integral to how I move through the world, and I think how many people who are recovering from religious trauma can start to find those places of, "Oh, healing can happen. There may actually be a world of love out there." And whether we tie that love to God theologically, well, I would, but whether we do that or not, that sense of there is goodness, there is love, there is delight in the world, that feels so important to me, and a lot of my theology hinges on those things. Um,
Mhm. Well, for you in your own life, was there anything as you explored theology that was really positively impact your healing? Like, obviously, I was kind of talking in general about maybe some of the folks that you worked with, but what has that been a part of your experience, and what are some of those theologies, if that's the case?
Mhm. I love Rene Girard, but more specifically, the work that James Allison has done on kind of taking Girard's philosophy and bringing it into the theological realm. This belief of um, not only do we all belong, but there is no competition between God and humans, between
Mm,
in this kind of this sense of new way of being in the world, that it's not about power, even though power is a system. But how do we step into a world where um, we subvert power? I think there's deep themes of liberation in that. I mean, Allison has studied with the liberationists since he was very young. Um, but that way of seeing the world, of not who is in and out, but instead we are all in, and can we continue to be invited into uh, contemplation about all the ways that we push people out, but also push ourselves out, and bring those parts into community. Um,
mhm,
that is profound to me. Um,
mhm. It definitely touches on some things, something that I really think about quite a bit is like how I can relate to the conservative people in my life still. And how do I think about them as in, even though I think that they're perpetuating and part of systems that are trying to discreate community or trying to sever community,
mhm.
and trying to create the in and the out, right? And how do I not have resentment towards those people, but try to figure out how can I be in relationship that with them in ways that hopefully they can be changed to like I was changed. And I'm curious, like again, like with some of the work that you've done in in the therapy realm, like how do you think through? All right, people can change. How do we get people to relate to the other people in their lives that haven't changed? I would imagine that's got to be a really important part of the healing journey for people that you're working with who have religious traumas. How do you even relate to the people that have been a part of creating the trauma in their lives to begin with?
Yep. You, so I would say you get to be resentful. You get to have resentment. That I don't think resentment is bad. I think resentment is often, and Brene Brown says this. Resentment is often a sign of there not being a boundary somewhere where there should have been.
Mm,
And so I view resentment as a sense of almost a direct compass towards where are the boundaries that we need to put up with people, because I don't know that the answer is always being in community with anyone and everyone.
mm,
That just because I believe everyone is in doesn't mean that I have to be in community with that person,
mm,
right? Like, I can still believe that they're in and have them at a distance or not even interact with them, right? I don't
mhm,
think that means that they are not in. And so I think learning how to set and work with our own boundaries. It- w- I don't think healing means letting people who harmed us continue to walk all over us, right? Like, and so I think there are ways. Yes, we can set a boundary with someone who's harmed us. They can honor that boundary. There can start to be repair and reconciliation, and that can be a process.
mhm,
I think for many of us, though, that may not be possible, because those people may not be willing to enter into what reconciliation might actually look like. And at that point, I think we have to ask, like, not how do we be in community with those people, but how do we actually honor our own boundaries,
mm,
and not interact with those people. Mm,
mhm. One of the things that I really like about your book that kind of reminds me around these boundaries is that even though but for both you and I, our stories is we grew up in this conservative evangelical world and then moved into a different kind of Christian world. But when it comes to rediscovering one's faith, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have the Christian faith, right? And
Right.
you're very clear around that in the book, and that's one of the reasons why I really like this book. And obviously for folks listening to this podcast, that might be their story, is that they maybe left conservative evangelicalism and found a new kind of faith. And I
Mhm.
think that's a really, really great step for people in that healing. I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are around people finding new faith that is not Christian faith when they, leave kind of these more religious trauma sort of faith spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, um, I I I think my caveat in all of this is, are we stepping into more freedom? Are we stepping into more healing? Because I think the tendency can be, when we have left a system of trauma, is that we can find ourselves right back in a system of trauma, that without even knowing it, right? Because of, and I talk
Mm,
about this a lot in the book, the way that our nervous systems regulate to environments and how difficult that is for that to shift. Um, when we've been in environments of trauma, other environments of trauma are going to feel safe and comfortable. And so I think, regardless of where we go, what faith we might go to, my question is, are we stepping into more freedom? Are we stepping into more integration, into more healing? And if so, then, like, well done. Um, like, can we trust that,
mm,
that process? Yeah.
mhm. I'm guessing a lot of like conservative Christians aren't going to read your book. But if they did, if there were some that did, what would you want them to know about those who wholly run away?
Oh, I mean, it feels like futile to say this, because my book isn't going to convince anyone of anything. At least on that side, like, but my hope would be that it would allow them to take us a little bit more seriously. That
Mm,
they would be able to see that there is reason for this, and that harm is actually real. Um, that would be my hope. But is it going to do that? Probably not.
right. No, I'm not trying to be wishful or a little,
Uh-huh.
too dreamy about it, but it would be it is interesting to think, like, what would you want that person to know if they were
Mhm.
going to take what you say seriously?
Yeah.
And I think it's an important thing to at least consider, right? And so,
Mhm.
but yeah, I think both of you and both of us, are not gonna be too wishful about that actually gonna be happening, but
Right,
who knows?
right. Because,
Who
I
knows?
mean, in all honesty, I didn't write the book for them. So,
Right. Totally.
like, that's not what the book's for. And, yeah, I, in a lot of ways, don't really care, but also care a lot. Like, both of those things are true. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah.
How do you hope Holy Runaways inspires and liberates its readers?
Yeah. I hope primarily it feels like a warm companion along this journey. And I hope that, whether folks are kind of just starting out on this runaway journey, or deconstruction journey, whatever, that it will feel that way. But also for folks who are much further along, that when they read it, it will help, again, integrate things that have happened. You may already be well beyond what I talk about in the book, but I hope it might give some language for, like, oh, here's what was actually happening when I did X, Y, and Z. This makes
Mm,
more sense now. Giving more room for, yeah, reflection, but also, yeah, companionship in that.
mhm. Yeah, one of the things that I found really, really healing when I first started going through the quote unquote deconstruction journey is finding companionship with people that I didn't know existed, where I was like, wait, I'm not the only one. When I
Mhm.
read like Rachel Held Evans or Nadia Bolts Weber or Brian McLaren or whoever it was, the almost the most transformative thing wasn't exactly the things that they were saying, it was the fact that I wasn't the only one having these kind of questions, and that was
Mhm.
really, really healing for me, and so
Yeah.
I hope that that's the case for people who read your book. Maybe they have no idea this kind of Christianity exists, or maybe they have no idea that leaving conservative, kind of toxic religions, is a thing that can happen, but if they find your
Mhm.
book, at the very least, I hope that they realize, "Wow, I'm not the only one."
Yeah. Yeah. I hope so too. Mhm. Yeah.
Last question, Matthias. How can listeners get connected to you and your work?
Yeah. I'm across the internet at Matthias Roberts, matthiasroberts.com. pretty easy to find me. And Holy Runaways is available wherever you buy books.
Where would you recommend people buy the book?
Your local bookstore.
Of course.
Or bookshop.org, because that supports local bookstores. Yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Love it. Well, Matthias, thank you so much for writing the book, chatting a little bit more about it. I think it's so great. And so I'm just really grateful that you wrote it and that you wanted to chat with me about it. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Ever since I saw that you were going to release it, I was like, got to get you back on the podcast. So
Yeah.
thank you so
Well,
much.
thanks for having me. This is fun.